Hi, I'm Manya Gupta and welcome to ThePrint. The proposed 8.7 kilometers Chenab-Beas Tunnel Link Project intends to divert surplus water from the Chenab River straight into the Beas Basin located in Himachal Pradesh. The project, no doubt an engineering marvel, has raised alarms on the other side of India's border, sparking concerns that it might undermine the historic Indus Waters Treaty of 1960. Pakistan's climate change minister Musaddiq Malik warned that Pakistan would cut the hands of anyone who blocked its share of water. Surviving several full scale wars, relentless border skirmishes, and repeated diplomatic hiatus, the treaty, up until now, delicately managed to divorce the issue of water sharing from the larger bilateral tensions between the two countries. However, New Delhi's current geopolitical positioning, especially with the proposed Chenab-Beas Link Tunnel project, pushes the subcontinent's water diplomacy into an unfamiliar terrain. The treaty divided the basin into two parts. The three western rivers, Jhelum, Chenab, and Indus, were assigned to Pakistan, and the three eastern rivers, Ravi, Beas, and Satluj, went to India. The common perception that India surrendered the western rivers tells only half the tale. India's rights on the western rivers, including non-consumptive use, run of the river hydropower, limited irrigation, and even storage within the limits, remain underutilized to this day. This is precisely what India intends to rectify with the proposed Chenab-Beas Link project. To maximize the permissible rights under the treaty, the message is clear. For India, any future talks on water can't be separated from the bigger questions of national security and sovereignty. It is not the first time that the idea of suspension of IWT has been entertained in Indian policy circles. With every act of terrorism or significant escalations, the debate found its way back to the forefront. In the aftermath of the 2016 Uri attacks, Prime Minister Narendra Modi made India's intentions loud and clear.
भारत का मत एकदम स्पष्ट है। टेरर और टॉक एक साथ नहीं हो सकते। टेरर और ट्रेड एक साथ नहीं चल सकते और पानी और खून भी एक साथ नहीं बह सकता।
From the Indian standpoint, Pakistan has only itself to blame. With India running out of other policy levers, putting the treaty in abeyance is a deterrence measure, a means to escape the cost of terrorism. India is showing Pakistan that responses like Operation Sindoor aren't the only risk. It could end up irreversibly losing the IWT. The message here is clear. If terrorism stops, the treaty could be resumed. Beyond the Indian borders, concerns and threats have been conveyed without any sugarcoating. Pakistani Army Chief Field Marshal Asim Munir, while addressing Pakistani diaspora in the United States in August 2025, had declared that Indus River is not the Indian family property and that Pakistan has no shortages of missiles. The IWT has clearly entered uncharted terrain. With clouds of doubts looming over its future, it only takes us back to the context in which the treaty came into existence. Following the British departure from the prized colony, the division of Indus River system was just as haphazard as the abrupt Radcliffe Line, disregarding both common sense and geography. While most canals went to Pakistan, the headworks of two major canals, Upper Bari Doab Canal and the Dipalpur Canal, were left behind in India. The simmering tensions came ashore in April 1948 when East Punjab government temporarily suspended water supplies to the two canals flowing into West Punjab. Though the supplies were restored shortly, the damage was done. The episode left deep uneasiness in Islamabad, reinforcing its anxieties as a lower riparian state. The Indus Basin could no longer be taken for granted, and fears of weaponization of water sent chills down Islamabad's spine. With that, cries of Pakistan might return to being a desert reverberated across the country. Thus, the episode of 1948 marked the formal beginning of what eventually culminated into one of the most lasting disputes between India and Pakistan. Up until now, the subcontinent's rivers had formidably defied the limits of man-made borders for 13 years after partition. But on the shores of Karachi on 19 September 1960 came another partition. Prime Minister Nehru, Field Marshal Muhammad Ayub Khan, in the presence of co-signatory William Iliff, Vice President of World Bank, signed the Indus Waters Treaty, one of the most awaited and consequential water-sharing treaties in history. While Ayub Khan, in a broadcast on June 1960, said that the solution is not an ideal one, yet an ugly situation that might have emerged has been avoided. His counterpart, Nehru, believed it was a good treaty for India. With that, the Indus River system stood partitioned. But the peace that Nehru expected came at a price, a mounting sum of 62 million pounds, which India was liable to pay Pakistan to finance replacement canals from the western rivers. The world watched with bated breath, wondering if this historic treaty could remain insulated from the turbulent bilateral tides between the two countries. The treaty, however, left a bitter aftertaste on both sides of the border. A wave of uproar arose in the parliament about what was seen as India's one-sided generosity. The unanimous consensus was that as an upper riparian state, India had given way too much. Leading the charge was Ashok Mehta and Thakur Das Bhargava, questioning how a treaty with such broad consequences was signed without even a whisper to the parliament. Recurring fault lines in Indian federalism of central overreach was also raised. The 80-20 narrative dominated the debate. It was viewed as a strange division. India, with a much larger population, with the vast areas of arid and desert land, has received merely 20% of Indus Basin water. The question was straightforward. Why, in addition to forging the lion's share of water, is India expected to pay for replacement works in Pakistan? As a result, many MPs called it as a second partition or treaty of surrender. However, for Nehru, the wisdom behind the treaty was clear. With years of negotiation, technical oversight, and closest attention to details given, Nehru urged the parliamentarians not to evaluate through a blurred prism of numbers. It is the context that mattered. Was the treaty a pragmatic trade-off, or did India end up compromising its position? Well, India was a young nation, with wounds of colonial rule still fresh, financially strained, and struggling to pull millions out of poverty. The options were clearly limited. There were practical reasons for it. For developmental value, it was important to secure uncontested control of the eastern rivers. And since these rivers meandered through the plains, it was relatively easier to harness them. Over 60 years later, the debate still continues. One side of the Indian camp continues to question the extraordinary generosity that still strangles the country's needs. They argue that the treaty controls India's use of water of western rivers while imposing no parallel restrictions on Pakistan. Questions are also raised about Pakistan's exploitation of treaty's dispute resolution mechanism, using the treaty as a strategic tool to keep Indian projects stalled in a web of objections, review, and arbitration. Projects such as Baglihar Dam, Kishanganga, Pakaldul, and Tulbul have all borne the brunt of prolonged disputes, with cost escalations and delays extending sometimes into decades. Without exhausting commissioner-level dialogues, Pakistan has made a habit of simultaneously taking every dispute to a neutral expert and a court of arbitration, thinking that it could expand it to other areas, for instance, the Kashmir issue. What's important is to understand that in Pakistan, water is much more than a resource. It's a deeply emotive and political issue. As a result, the treaty has become highly politicized and is often used to fuel anti-India sentiments in Pakistan, while shifting attention away from country's own poor management of water resources. However, this was just one side of the story. There's also a camp that acknowledges the rationale behind the compromise. But there is a growing consensus among them that a renegotiation can no longer be kept off the table. Amit Ranjan, research fellow at Institute of South Asian Studies, National University of Singapore, told ThePrint that no treaty is without flaws. Its success hinges less on the content and more on the willingness of the parties to make it work. Questions of compromise depends who is telling the story. And more importantly, the underlying relations between the countries. Shared rivers necessitates shared rules. The treaty attempted exactly that, to manage a shared resource based on cooperation than conflict. The treaty does guarantee India rights on western rivers, including non-consumptive use, run-of-the-river hydropower, limited irrigation, and even the storage within limits. So it is not the question of what India gave away, but it could have utilized realistically. 3.6 million acre-feet of water is legally India's share of western rivers, the majority of which just flows down unused. India therefore lacks the infrastructure needed to utilize even the water promised under the treaty. Indus barely flows through the Indian territory before entering Pakistan, so arguments about numbers and percentages are futile. Focus should rather be on the management of water resources. India has not sufficiently invested in storage, diversion, and irrigation infrastructure required to fully harness those entitlements, though it is now being addressed to some extent by the NDA government. One thing is clear, that the strategic logic of the 1960s that defined the Indus Waters Treaty no longer holds true. And Indus Waters Treaty 2.0 is definitely in sight.
The idea that water cooperation could remain insulated from security concerns no longer holds. And in my assessment and responding to your question, a return to the status quo ante is unlikely. Right? So the real question is not whether the treaty will change, but what form that change will take. And I think that's important. Renegotiation, revision, or a phase restructuring appears, to my mind, increasingly inevitable because the agreement was designed for a hydrological and geopolitical environment in the 50s, and that does not longer hold, that no longer exists. And I think several factors make an update necessary. I think the treaty requires an update. Right? Climate change has introduced unprecedented variability into river flows, through the glaciers retreat and changing snowfall patterns and, extreme weather events. The likely path forward is not the abandonment of international water law, but its adaptation.
Any Indian demands of renegotiation, however, should be mindful of its dual identity, both as an upper and lower riparian state. Asserting unhindered autonomy could endanger its lower riparian status in relation to China. It will serve India well to vouch for a defined, predictable, and rules based governance structure. The problem does not end or begin with the treaty.
Issue right now is not the Indus Waters Treaty. Everyone seems to think that the problem begins and ends with the Indus Waters Treaty. That's not so, because river water issues are always problematic in the case of transboundary rivers. The problem does not begin with the Indus Waters Treaty. The issue begins with the deep downturn in India-Pakistan relations.
Thank you and keep watching The Print.